Recovery exercising is this notion that you are testing or exercising certain capabilities within your organization to respond, recover from any type of cyber-specific or cybersecurity-specific scenario, like a data breach or denial-of-service attack or something to that effect. With recovery exercising, recovery testing, a lot of organizations go through the business continuity planning process to think through, okay, what would happen to my business if we were hit by a fire, a flood, tsunami, whatever the case may be, some type of physical incident. Where a lot of organizations have difficulty is with thinking through what happens to me if I'm hit by a cyber-specific incident. Again, denial of service attack, data breach, something like that. But recovery exercising is about planning to make sure that your business, whatever your critical business functions are, can actually survive and resume after a particular incident. As you're going through the planning process, you're coming up with, what's going to happen, who needs to be notified, what are my escalation procedures, what backups do I need to have in place, how do I restore those backups. As you go through all of that, your recovery exercise itself should follow a very similar process. So your exercise should test things like, how do I notify people? How do I escalate, the incident? What are my communications plans? How do I talk with the media? How do I make shareholder statements if you're a public company? All of these recovery exercising plans should address, recovery exercising should address the things that are in your continuity plans. And it's important to note that you ought to be testing your plans on a regular basis. Things change over the course of 6 months, a year. You have new technology in place, your vendors change, whatever the case may be. But it's important to make sure that as you're going through exercising things, that you're validating these plans and then updating them accordingly. For test strategies, really the exercising should follow the plans that you have in place and make sure that you test each aspect of that. So during the planning process for one of these tests, you really ought to identify what the expectations are for business lines and support functions, who's going to be playing in the exercise, what's their role in the exercise going to be, the description of testing to be accomplished. This is the scope of the exercise. What are my goals and objectives for doing this particular exercise test? From a staff perspective, who needs to be involved in this? Are we involving all of our facilities or just this one subset? What kind of technology are we going to need to put in place to do an effective test? External and internal dependencies. If I'm testing my public relations or media communications plan, do I want to involve the actual media and do a full test with that, or do I just want to simulate use of the media? And then, of course, what are the assumptions used in this test strategy? As all of that put together becomes your exercise plan. So for scope and objectives, this is the point where a lot of organizations get into trouble because they don't scope things properly. They don't understand or they don't set effective goals for the exercise, and therefore come out with mismatched expectations about what they want to get out of it. But from a test perspective, the first and foremost, you don't necessarily want to jeopardize normal business operations. Again, if the point is to exercise a business continuity plan or communications plan, you don't want to bring everything down just to test it. You're kind of inducing moments of panic and all of that in there. So generally speaking, with these recovery exercising, you don't want to jeopardize normal business operations. You might want to increase complexity as you go through exercise after exercise. You don't want to start off with big full-scale exercise when really you just need to walk through the plan to begin with. And simple discussion-based exercises might be enough to do that. From a scope perspective, again, you really want to look at how do I test these parts of the plan so that we can demonstrate that we have the ability to do this? And again, that could be through a variety of means, but what you're really trying to do is find out where this plan has gaps. My plan doesn't cover talking to the media, but you know what? We're really going to have to talk to them if we have a data breach. You're trying to find the gaps in the plan so that you can do something about it. And then the last point here is you want to include, as part of your exercise strategy, you want to include as many events as you can within the time frame that you've got to be able to do an adequate test. Consider the realm of the possible, bound it by time, and that's what you have that you run as your exercise. There are various kinds of exercises. The first one here, probably the easiest to actually implement, is this notion of a structured walkthrough or a tabletop exercise. It's very common to do these in organizations. A lot of companies do this. But it's an easy way to just sit down and look at your continuity plan, your recovery plan, and just step through step one. We would do this. Let's talk about it. Could we actually do that? Step two, could we actually do this as well? And so you're stepping through your plan, seeing, can you actually meet or do what the plan says, trying to identify, what are the weaknesses in that plan and what do we do about it? So again, tabletop exercise, it's called tabletop because literally everybody sits around the same table talking about how would we actually do something or how would we actually react to this particular scenario. It's good for not only gap analysis, but helping you identify or making people comfortable with the plan. So, it's just like exercising, physical exercise. If you do a bunch of push-ups every day, you're going to get better and better at it. Same with tabletop exercise. If you take your communication plan and run it every 3 or 4 months, the people involved in that plan are going to get better and better at it. Next step here is our next increase in complexity would be a simulation test or a walkthrough drill. This is where you're actually practicing the steps. So rather than just talking about it, now we're going to practice the steps. If it means, if my plan says, call the media and set up an interview, I'm going to make sure that I've got the phone number. I may even call and see if if I've got the right phone number. But I'm looking for specific functional responses here, and I'm making sure that I can take those tactical level steps. I might need all or some or all of the response teams to actually go through this and test it, but I'm not actually doing any recovery. I'm just making sure that I could do the steps in this. And so we're increasing a little bit of complexity here. We're adding, people actually taking, actions on the keyboard rather than just discussing it. And you can involve different degrees of actual response versus simulated response to the plan. One more step up in the complexity, you have this functional drill. This idea that I'm doing the actual steps associated with this, but instead of having it happen on our production systems, I'm doing it on a non-production, a backup copy, a alternate copy, maybe a hot data center, whatever the case may be. But I'm taking my actual steps and I'm going to recover a backup copy of our production systems or an alternate set of production systems. The point is to actually go through the recovery plan and make sure that all the steps works without impacting production systems. And then the last one on this chain at the top of the complexity scale is this full interruption test or a full scale test. And just like the one on the previous screen where we're talking about parallel exercise, we're actually going to do the steps that our plan calls for. But we're actually going to do it on our live production systems. Now, you typically don't see this except in organizations that have complete hot sites. I mean, actual, parallel processing, everything is mirrored, where you can take down one data center over here and have your other data center just seamlessly do everything for you. And so you might actually test the cutover process. You might make sure that your recovery systems and the failover from data center 1 to data center 2 actually works. And that the people involved in the response actually know what they're doing. They're actually taking the steps on the keyboard. They're actually calling the people they need to do. You're validating your ability to respond in a crisis. Again, failover from one center to another. I'll give you an example of this. There was an internet organization who has data centers on the East Coast and the West Coast. And they created an exercise plan. They wanted to do a failover, a full interruption test. They wanted to shut off their West Coast data center and watch as everything migrated to the East Coast. And they were still able to, they wanted to test that failover process worked. Well, the only way to really test it is to pull the power on it. Shut everything down on the West Coast and watch everything go over. And so they set up this exercise where, on the appointed D-Day, they would actually shut the power off to their data center and see what would happen. And so what they found was the failover process. They started the exercise. They shut down data center on the West Coast. They watched all the transactions, all the processing migrate over to the East Coast data center, and everything was great. Their hot site worked perfectly with data mirroring and everything else. What they hadn't considered was, all right, how do we get back from here, our East Coast center, to the West Coast? So their exercise was a success. What they found out of it was they don't know how to migrate from East Coast back to West Coast. So, kind of resuming operations was where they found an issue. Just to kind of show where all these particular exercises are on the scale. So if we have complexity, on this scale, we have exercises on this scale. The 4 exercises that we talked about, where we had, let's just do this. Somewhere about here, you have TTXs, tabletop exercises. Somewhere here, you have drills. You might have parallel tests here, and up here, you have full scale. And I'll add one more axis here. Fidelity of results. So as you kind of go up this scale here, at a tabletop exercise, they're not incredibly complicated, but your fidelity of results, what you're actually getting out of the exercise, is going to be somewhat limited because it's people sitting around a table talking about what we're going to do. It's very appropriate to do these types of exercises, but don't have the expectation that what's going to come out of there is, okay, Billy Bob over there doesn't know what he's doing from a recovery standpoint. So as you increase the scale, up here, where you have full scale exercise, the complexity goes up, exponentially, but your fidelity of results also gets better. So it's here that you would actually see that Billy Bob doesn't know how to operate a computer, and he doesn't know how to take the appropriate response actions. That's where you get different fidelity of results across these various exercises. And then lastly, it's supremely important that you actually take action as a result of these exercises that you're doing. You might decide that your response plans need a quarterly review, and every year you do an audit or an exercise of the procedures that are in place. Your exercise should dictate changes to the input plan, whatever that plan was. If it was a business continuity plan, whatever you learned during your exercise has to go in to update those plans. Otherwise, why did you do the exercise? Things like versioning control of documents will help you make sure that you don't lose track of what you learned. But really, at the end of the day, you want to make sure that as you're doing exercises, the point of doing them is to learn from them and update your plans accordingly so that when the when it does actually happen in real life, you're not sitting there thinking about, okay, what do I do now?